All right, guys, I'm going to go back and record the lecture this week. It seems like on your document analysis, you do a lot better on them when I've done the lecture. Number one, I want to apologize for the way I sound. I'm pretty sure that I had the flu last week. So my apologies that you're going to have to listen to me sounding like this. Um, Anyways, I want to kind of look at life in the South. And the thing to think about is when we look at these things today, there are many perspectives of slavery. Today, if we think about it, what's some of our favorite movies to compare the South to? I mean, Django Unchained is one we can look at. 12 Years a Slave. I mean, there's even perspectives like if you watch Gone with the Wind that give completely different versions of what life in the South was like. But even at the time, perspective is really, I mean, and that's what I'm trying to get you to see whenever you read these primary source documents and you're completing these worksheets. Is the perspective of putting yourself in the shoes at that time and relating it back to the larger picture of what we're talking about in class. So if we look at slavery in the South, or if we look at the South in general, some of those perspectives are from the North. Some of those perspectives are from the South. Some of those perspectives are from slaves that escaped to the North, and some are interviews after slavery was abolished. The majority of people in the South, though, could not afford slaves, but it was a system in which racial lines were firmly drawn around class lines. Initially, the North and South were similar in that everyone was British colonizers. They declared independence and fought for the same cause. Alex de Tocqueville said, almost all the difference which may be noticed between the character of the Americans in the Southern and Northern have originated in slavery. And if you look at it, the North was very much divided by class. There was an economic mixture. Some of that being agriculture, some being commerce, some being manufacturing. In the North, a free black population of approximately 250,000 free blacks to 19 million whites. Now that's a very small group if you really look at it. It's a very small ratio, it's a very small percentage. And 90% of the nation's industrial workers lived in the North. If we look at the West, many slave owners moved to the West for new soil and took their slaves with them. And mainly because that area was perfect to grow cotton. They had 200 frost-free days a year, which allowed for the cotton to grow and to get quite a bit of harvest out of that. And there was also plentiful rain. So we're looking from southern Carolina to West Texas, became known as the Cotton Kingdom. There were very clear racial lines established in this area, and it helped whites bridge the difference in wealth, education, and culture. So no matter what, if you were a white person, you weren't at the very bottom of a social or economic pyramid. So basic statistics, the North abolished slavery in 1804. And if we look at the slave numbers, 1790, less than 700,000 slaves just to begin with. By 1830, there are 2 million, 1860, 4 million. So 1 in 3 were African American. And this growth, so if you look at these numbers, this is the basic way that slaves reproduce. So 1790, you're looking 700,000. Those came from the transatlantic slave trade. 1830, you don't have that transatlantic slave trade anymore, and you have 2 million slaves. 1860, they're 4 million. So you're looking at the primary way that these slave families grow so much is through natural reproduction. Um, and keep in mind that transatlantic slave trade was outlawed in 1808. So you can see where these numbers definitely increase from natural reproduction. 1 out of 4 whites lived in a slaveholding family. So I just mentioned a minute ago that the majority of people in the South did not own slaves. So that would be only 1 out of 4. Those who did own slaves owned fewer than 5 slaves. Only about 12% of slave owners owned 20 or more slaves. 52% of all slaves lived on plantations. And I know this is a lot of statistics, but it's something you've got to kind of look at to get a real clear picture. 75% of plantation slaves produce export crops. 60% of American exports were cotton, which explains that need to spread west in places where you could yield a lot of cotton. And this development in the South meant few cities, few industrial jobs, and very few immigrants. Language, food, music, religion, and accents, in part, were shaped in the South by African American culture. We tend to operate under this idea that all people of the South own slaves. And two words I want you to take note of right now. One is a planter, and a planter is someone who owns less than 20 slaves. When we talk plantations, we're talking a person who owns more than 20 slaves. So a plantation owner has more than 20. So there's all kinds of defenses of slavery. Some of those come from a commitment to white supremacy. Leading New Orleans physician named Samuel Adolphus Cartwright wrote in 1851, and he wrote an article called "Report on the Disease of and Physical Peculiarities of the Negro Race." And what he does is he uses so-called science to defend slavery. And some of the things that came out in his so-called research was that the blood is blacker and the brain is smaller and things like that. Indeed, because of what he said was because of the particular formation of the Negro brain, there is nothing in his music addressing the understanding. It has melody but no harmony. His songs are mere sounds without sense or meaning. He also went on to say that slavery is actually an improvement over the government of their forefathers. So being in slavery was better than being in Africa. And this is a quote from him where he said, "Under the compulsive power of the white man, they are made to labor or exercise, which makes the lungs perform the duty of vitalizing the blood more perfectly than is done when they are left free to indulge in idleness." And that came from page 160 of his book. Southern academics, writers, and clergy really do create very imaginable defenses for slavery. So he uses a medical way. A lot of clergy will use the Bible to show where slavery is talked about in the Bible, and so therefore it must be God's will that African Americans remain enslaved. And then you have things such as the slave codes. And what the slave codes are laws which require total submission of slaves, and these are done so primarily out of fear. It's more of where the white people have this fear that the slave population will rebel. They also have a very strong fear of Northern abolitionists. So if they can do things like preaching that that slavery is of the Bible, then they can kind of convince themselves and combat arguments against slavery, because they would say it was God's will, or maybe even if you go back and look at Cartwright, say, medically this is the way it has to be. And what the slave codes did was it required total submission of slaves. Basically, they owe masters respect, absolute obedience, authority of all whites and not just masters. So if someone were a slave, any white person could beat them, any white person could enforce certain behaviors on them or inflict punishments. And another one of the codes was that any white could correct a slave. Another one was a slave was not permitted to keep a gun. If caught carrying a gun, the slave received 39 lashes and forfeited the gun. And one of the reasons this is because of that fear of rebellion. It keeps them from being able to organize and resist armed. And there's also this fear, the equal rights would lead to a sexual mixing of the races. And truthfully, there are cases that was already happening. But it is certainly in the South a fear that, you don't want that mix going on. They felt that if you look at this from a Southern perspective, they thought that slavery was necessary, that African Americans were inferior, that they were lesser beings. And they thought that they convinced themselves that slavery was a mass civilizing effort, and thought that it lifted them from being barbaric and from being savage. And then it taught African Americans disciplined work. And they thought that most importantly, it taught them Christianity. There was a lot of time spent coming up with reasons for why slavery was a good thing. So really, it was completely reinforced by religion. Religious defense of slavery. On one hand, Southern ministers preached about the necessity of masters to treat their slaves well. But in essays like 1851 work titled The Duties of Christian Masters, it also directly gave an affirmation of slavery. And you can look at it. Slavery was rooted in the biblical narrative. Abraham had slaves. God had tested Job in part by taking his slaves and then restored them as a reward for his piety. Leviticus set out rules for governing slaves. And the Old Testament never really does condemn slavery. They even found foundational support in the New Testament. An essay published in DeBow's Review in 1850. This is just as the Compromise of 1850 was being finalized. It was stated in that essay, "We think we can show that the Bible teaches clearly and conclusively that the holding of slaves is right, and if so, no deduction from general principles can make it wrong if that book is true." Southern ministers accepted the idea that only through enslavement could Christian morality be imposed upon slaves. But the problem is slavery, biblical slavery, is entirely different from the slavery that we see emerge in the United States. Biblical slavery, typically, if a person converted to Christianity, then they can no longer be held as a slave. Especially, if you look at the Muslim faith also, if that slave converts to that religion, and truly converts to that religion, then they can't be held as a slave anymore. So there's issues with this argument, but nobody really questioned how different it was. Because the slavery in the United States emerges as a racialized system, nobody really questions that because, in the South, they don't want to. They've got to come up with all these reasons that it's okay. We will continue looking at that in the next video.